is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is also president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and his Twitter is at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser joins us now. Dr. Jasser, first off, welcome back. Thanks for making time for us tonight.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
As a former lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, you have, I know there's many lenses that you look through this as, tactically and otherwise. And I think to myself, when you hear about a kidnapping from Boko Haram, if you were to advise the president on how to handle this type of situation, what would you have him do in the way of military support or somehow coordination and advice?
Well, I think you have to look at this in two different fashions. One is the acute problem of poor 300 girls that have disappeared and maybe exterminated. And, you know, Nigeria is not only an ally, but resolving this is the right thing to do. And I'd agree with Senator McCain to the point that we should do anything possible to provide them support to find those girls and get them out. Now, does that mean we have to send troops in? You know, we've already sent intelligence experts. My understanding is there's some drones already gathering information in the region. So anything we can do to help them, like any ally that would reach out to us with an acute military situation within their borders that simply would need either experts, SEALs, or whatever necessary to do that, is an operation that I think America has been doing in our long history. The bigger question is, though, is Boko Haram, which is a large organization that has been not only a sort of the tip of the iceberg of the radicalization problem in Nigeria, and that needs a larger strategy. If you listen to Secretary Kerry in his speech in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, he really didn't talk about Islamism, didn't talk about
Let's talk about that. I actually have a clip from Secretary Kerry and his attribution to poverty for the reason for these types of groups like Boko Haram. Roll it.
See with what is happening in Nigeria with Boko Haram, the extents to which this can disrupt the world. It's a challenge to all of us. And what I saw in Africa convinced me as I talked to leader after leader and asked them how they balance this tension of these challenges that they face. They all talked about poverty and the need to alleviate poverty, and that much of this challenge comes out of this poverty, where young people are grabbed at an early stage, proffered a little bit of money, their minds are bended, and then the money doesn't matter anymore. They've got the minds, and they begin to direct them into these very extreme endeavors.
Now, the reason I delayed playing that just for a moment, Dr. Jasser, is I want people to realize, hey, we understand the president can do a number of things when it comes to fighting the enemy. But a part of this is not just about Boko Haram, as you've mentioned. It's about the war that we are in against Islamists and radical Islamist groups who believe in Islamic supremacy. And that cannot be compartmentalized as something that we look at over on the side here. That's got to be a part of our comprehensive strategy. First off, would you agree? And secondly, does Secretary of State Kerry understand our enemy?
You know, I'm so glad you played that clip because it runs at the core of the legacy of this administration, which is going to be, we have lost the biggest opportunities could be in the 21st century, which is the Arab awakening since 2011, has left a vacuum that could have been the advancement of liberty and the reforms necessary against all these dictators and Islamists and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And instead, that vacuum is getting filled by what I would call a Darwin doctrine, that the worst and most evil have thrived. And Boko Haram is just part of the byproducts of the Islamist ideology that's spreading through, as we saw with the Brotherhood in Egypt, with Nahda in Tunisia, the Saudis continue to spread their ideas. Qatar is spending billions on owning media in the West, and yet we can't even say the word Islamism, and we're blaming poverty. And you see in The Guardian today, the Islamists are writing reports on their front page in Western media that, oh, this might be climate change, or it might be poverty that's doing this, or the vestiges of colonialism, when in fact any of the reformist Muslims can tell you, as you and I have discussed so much before, that the reason they blame the others is they know that if we start talking about political Islam, the reformists will start to get more amplification, more attention, and will realize that it's like the alcoholic that wants to blame everybody else on their alcoholism instead of dealing with the addiction itself inside themselves. And as I talk about in my book, Battle for the Soul of Islam, this is an internal fight within the House of Islam, and America and the West needs to take sides. And until we take sides, we're going to keep this whack-a-mole program from Boko Haram to Pakistan's blasphemy laws to Al-Qaeda's that are growing and growing because we're not dealing with the problem.
And again, as you see and have talked about and written about the fact that we had the Arab Spring turn into the Islamist winter by not recognizing it, the establishment, across the pond, recognizing what the establishment Islamists have over there, their pull, people would be very surprised. I went on, just doing some background for this interview, went and checked out CAIR's updates and Media Machine, and they detail their ties to Congress, meeting with Congress. Now, Council of American Islamic Relations, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Jasser, pardon me, is a unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial for their support of Hamas. Tell me, first off, is that true? And would people be taken aback by seeing how the Islamists have gotten control of those in power with influence in shaping the debate and discussion and thereby our strategy on how to defeat Islamists?
Well, you know, this is exactly what's happening at every turn, is these organizations that claim to speak on behalf of Muslims are basically manipulating American sensibilities for freedom of religion in order to prevent the criticism of their movements. CAIR came out of the Islamic Association of Palestine in the mid-90s. It's basically, its leaders were all Palestinian sympathizers with Hamas, and they've maintained that sympathy. They can't even, as we talked about in the film that I narrated called The Third Jihad, they can't even articulate a clear condemnation of Hamas, which is still a terrorist organization according to our government. And their apologetics about terror are clear, and yet they say they condemn violence, but yet they don't condemn the bigger problem, which is the Islamism, or the concept of the Islamic State, or the countries of the OIC. CAIR wrote a letter to Gaddafi in 2009 asking for $15 million in Arabic, calling him His Excellency of Islam and a wonderful leader for peaceful Islam. Here you have a misogynist, thug, dictator, rapist, who they're calling a wonderful example of Islam, and America thinks that somehow their words about Islam and their offense, whether it be at the 9/11 Museum, which is their current thing, whatever it is, they want to turn the debate away from the reforms necessary and away from what's really the product of what produces the Boko Harams of the world, to allow themselves to continue their operations globally and make America sort of anesthetized to the real issue.
In describing and discussing and exposing what they are, when they come out with condemning Boko Haram, or they come out with a condemnation for a terrorist act, you got into that in a little in your last response, but what should we be on the lookout for? Give us a lens to see that for what it is.
Well, I think ultimately, you know, when the focus is simply on the means and not on the ends, all red flags should go up. And if they say, well, you know, Boko Haram's vision of an Islamic State, of Sharia law that gives women second-class status, doesn't want them in education, if you see programs coming out of their organization reforming those ideas, then yeah, they are moderate. But if all they're doing is saying that, you know, that their acts are should be condemned and that the violence and the means is un-Islamic, well, fine. The Muslim Brotherhood was most upset about Al-Qaeda not necessarily about their anti-Westernism or their anti-Semitism. They were upset about how they outed what their mission was globally, that their mission was to defeat the West and advance Islamism over liberty. They were upset about the means of targeting New York City and American civilians because it woke up America to what they were doing. But the end goal of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, coming together as Islamic states and using their petrodollar cash to basically bolster the information operation of advancing Sharia and advancing Islamism and Salafism and all of these ideologies, if Muslims aren't openly articulating a condemnation of the theological foundations that we need to reform, then they're part of the problem, not part of the solution.
I appreciate you detailing that. I realize how that question sounds, but at the same time, I want people to realize that there's a shell game going on, and what you just did is you cut right through it, got to the core, and gave us a focus of what we should interpret and learn and listen, and you're educating us all. Let me ask you this. What has your response been from fellow Muslims in America? Many of us as Americans, as you're American, I'm American, we're all Americans, we're sitting here, we're going, I wish the Muslim community would stand up and reject terrorism. You do that. Why aren't we seeing a greater amount of support for what you do?
Well, because it's, when we're trying to get amplitude and broad and get part of the bandwidth, we get marginalized as being Islamophobes and bigots, and you have the White House and media, so-called mainstream media, not come to us as part of the diverse panoply of Muslim organizations, but rather they simply go to the Islamists to say that there is one Islam and it's peaceful and it doesn't need reform, and continue to deceive the West into thinking there is no reform necessary, and the reformers are simply a bunch of self-hating Muslims rather than realists. So what happens is we can't get the platforms we need. And people say, well, why aren't you louder? Well, there's no recognition that there needs to be anyone taking sides. And I'd ask your listeners to find Tony Blair's speech from April 23rd, a few weeks ago, in which he talked about the change in the Middle East and how the West needs to take sides. And he used the word Islamism as a threat, talked about it, mentioned it over 30, 40 times in his speech, and just laid out what the threat is today. And it's unfortunate that we have British leaders doing that. Prime Minister Cameron today is doing that, and yet here in America we continue to ignore the problem.
And Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, we will post those two links, actually the link to the speech. We did cover his response to David Gregory a while back. We will get that along with your link, but this is about telling the truth, getting the truth out about Islam and its reformers. And as you said, the problem is people not knowing about you because you're being marginalized by the Islamist establishment within America. And we sit back and we go, no way. Yes way, it happens. That's why we're talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, because he has the courage to speak up, and he is doing what's right for all of us as Americans. And Dr. Jasser, the book is A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Your organization, it is growing because people are learning and knowing about it. President of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Your Twitter feed, at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for taking the time. I know we got a hard break here, so thank you for taking the time with us, and keep us updated. Thank you.
Absolutely. Anytime, Crane. Thank you.
Take care, buddy. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. As we talked about with Dr. Jasser, I have Dr. Jasser on a fair amount. I don't know if it's the time issue, and I try to get the guests that are topical, and I would talk to him more. He's an extraordinary man and extraordinary courage of what he has. Now, I realize some people have said, Crane, you are a Christian, you come from a Christian worldview, and you're having a Muslim on to talk about things, and what is that? Well, a couple things. One, I'm having a man on who is doing extraordinary work in exposing the truth about Islam. He's a Muslim reformer. And as with anybody, I believe that obviously I pray for him and all to come to Christ. So it is something I do. I make no apologies for it. But I want you to understand that there is a battle out there. And when we talk about Islam and Islamism, we don't have politicians who have enough fortitude to call out what Islam is and how he mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood exposing what this whole idea of Muslim supremacy is about. And we have Christians being slaughtered. We have Christians and Muslims and Jews being slaughtered, but Christians are being attacked within North Africa, the Middle East, and throughout the world. It's the most undercover story out there. But something that is even less covered than that is the fact that there is a Muslim establishment, an Islamic supremacist establishment here in the United States that meets with our political leaders, influences our laws, and that is a very powerful lobby. Not only that, our good friend, Dr. Waleed Phares, points out that they control the education because they run the Middle East Studies Department. Now, we're exposing this, and we expose it to all, and we desire for that exposure to reach a threshold where political leaders would have to answer for meeting with certain groups that are unindicted co-conspirators in terror investigations with ties to Hamas. And they would be asked to answer about that. The war that we are in is a war on Islamofascism. You can't take Islam out of the war that we are in or what the enemy theology is, and thereby its ideological roots. Ralph Peters weighed in on this. I believe it's cut number 21 and 22, or excuse me, cut 20 and 21, but I'm not sure. It could be cut 19 and 20. But Colonel Ralph Peters is this first part, of Colonel Ralph Peters' statement regarding the problem with the left and identifying our enemy. Now, I want you to know that Ralph Peters says, hey, look, I'm not beating up on the left because of ideological beliefs. He mentions the fact he's pro-choice. He mentions a whole host of things. But what he talks about is what we're all talking about so often. Why aren't we calling out the enemy for what they are and what they believe and exposing how awful and disgusting it is and how our system trumps their system with an ounce of common sense? We did it with communism. Roll it.
The American left and all the feminists have spent more energy defending a handful of terrorist thugs in Gitmo than they have spent over the years defending the rights of hundreds of millions of brutally oppressed women throughout the Islamic world. And now suddenly, it's the Beverly Hills Hotel and the Polo Lounge. And they're protesting that, even though, look, for years, these stars have been staying at the Fairmont, which is owned by Qataris and Saudis, staying at the Four Seasons. Hey, the Four Seasons is almost half owned by a Saudi. How are women's rights doing in Saudi Arabia right now?
And the good colonel continued, cut number 20. Roll it.
But the notion that the left has created of this lie about Republican war on women, while they are ignoring the brutality, brutal treatment of women. You have Boko Haram, obviously. You have women being punished for being raped. You have genital mutilation. You have stoning to death. But also the daily slavery, the oppression, the lack of freedom. And the American left says nothing about it. And let me give you a classic example. Yesterday, in the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof, the columnist, whose heart is in the right place, but who's ethically challenged, he wrote a 900-word column about the importance of education for women. And every example he cited of deprivation was an Islamic country. And yet, never in that column does he use the word Islam or the word Muslims. You see the left contorting itself, not to say that Boko Haram is an Islamist organization attempting to impose Sharia law. Now, that doesn't mean all Muslims are bad, but it does mean that if you look honestly at the world,
Right.
only in the Islamic world, are women brutally oppressed, and do they suffer the deprivation of rights?
Absolutely.
And the American left says nothing.
It's one of the reasons I have a great deal of respect and love for that man, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, who I'm proud to call a friend. I don't always agree. We've debated on different issues before. I don't always agree with him, but I respect him for calling it out. Now, you just heard what Ralph Peters said. You also heard that from Arnold Allard in his piece of exposing the left's response to Boko Haram and other hotels that he mentioned. And why aren't they getting it? Why are they looking at it as disconnected and not understanding it? President Bush was mocked for his freedom agenda. And when he advanced that, however imperfectly, there are a lot of things said about President Bush. It's not about President Bush, but it is about the truth, about what actually happened and what the goal is. Now, to me, I don't think you can stay away from the fact that a Judeo-Christian foundation is necessary to secure freedom. We should not apologize for it, and we should not ignore it, because it gives what we all enjoy, which is individual freedom. Freedom for religion, freedom of speech. But we cannot ignore our foundation. Keep in mind that when people say this is not a cultural crisis, it exactly is. Because when we talk about our foundation, our cultural foundation, and we choose to hide it or lie by omission, not tell the truth and omit it in some way, we do people who seek to be free a great disservice. We cannot ignore the foundation of freedom. Crane Durham's nothing but truth. Hey, live with honor in your life, compassion in your heart. Remember, it's a buffet. You can take it or leave it. Always keep the faith in Jesus Christ. God knows you, loves you. I say it pointing up and recognizing His grace. AFR Talk.